couple months ago, GDF made a video pointing out how Israel was able to spread pro-Zionist and pro-Israel propaganda through Hollywood, and who are the people in power that are responsible for it. One person mentioned in that video really surprised me. Haim Saban! Super Sentai was promised to him 3,000 years ago. That was me reacting to it live on Twitch. I promise you guys, once we get to 500 subs and maybe like 50 followers on Twitch, I'll start streaming again. That guy was Haim Saban, the guy who made Power Rangers. But more accurately, he's the guy who brought over the Japanese franchise, Super Sentai, over to the West. See, we in Asia over here, we already got Super Sentai back in like the 70s. Unfortunately for you guys in the West, you guys got the spiritually Israeli version made in the 90s. Trust me, that joke will make sense in a second. Just trust the process. But it led me down this rabbit hole of learning about different Zionist and pro-Israeli propaganda that has remained hidden within a lot of nerd media, so to speak. See, Haim Saban is a far-right Zionist. He himself served in the IDF during his youth, and eventually, when he finally got filthy fucking rich from the Power Rangers franchise, he started to involve himself with politics, especially if it's got anything to do with Israel. In his eyes, in the 90s, support for Israel by America was starting to slow down a lot. So he became an active donator to Israel and the IDF. And also, while he's not officially a part of AIPAC, he is kind of like a one-man army version of AIPAC. Haim Saban aligns himself with the views of the Israeli and Zionist far right, on their views about the Middle East, its people, Palestinians, and I guess the Arab world at large. In the US, he closely associates himself with the Democratic Party, funding politicians that are willing to be supportive of Israel. And since the Power Rangers franchise made him a billionaire, he has donated millions of dollars of his own money to the IDF. And this is not including the hundreds of millions of dollars raised in like fundraiser events that he did for Israel and the IDF, which has received donations from a lot of famous people, politicians, celebrities, and other ethically corrupt and morally bankrupt billionaires. Now remember the part that I say where Power Rangers is spiritually Israeli? There's a reason for that. Well, this is somewhat true, at least on the production side of things, and if you are into Power Rangers already, you'd probably know about this. But if you don't, well, since Power Rangers was a show that primarily uses footage from the Japanese franchise Super Sentai, all they did was shoot footage for the out-of-costume scenes, while all the action scene was from Japan. And this was done primarily to cut cost. Haim Saban could not help himself but to live with that stereotype, because making an actual proper adaptation of the Sentai show would have costed actual money. And in turn, Power Rangers is more well known than the series that it was adapting. Basically, Saban got the fame and money from something that was not even his, and benefited from it greatly. But that's not all. Saban also loves to severely underpay all the actors, especially the younger and underage actors, and regularly cut costs in the most nonsensical places. It's hilarious, to be honest, at how cheap the original MMPR show can get. To the point that sometimes this cost-cutting measure endangered multiple talents. And this is of course on top of the multiple allegations of racism, sexism, and homophobia. However, the franchise itself does not contain any sort of explicit pro-Zionist or pro-Israeli propaganda. At least if my memory is right, considering that Haim Saban himself did not have any sort of creative input to the series beyond the original MMPR. And even the creative input that he has was, again, due to the cost-cutting measure thing. But someone on my TikTok did comment how, ironically enough, the only Jewish representation that we got from the original series was during the wedding ceremony of Rita Repulsa and Lord Zed, the villains of the show. Make that of what you wish.
Come everyone, time to dance! Yeah, more it, baby!
I can't believe this.
There is another franchise or series, however, that does have explicit pro-Zionist or pro-Israeli propaganda. However, no one noticed it. Now, Marvel has had this weird thing going on with Israel. Prime example would be Sabra, the Israeli super soldier, who is kinda like Captain America, but she targets civilians and children. And while that is true, she is kind of an obvious example, you know? The one that I'm talking about that kind of went unnoticed by like damn near everybody would be the X-Men. Now, the X-Men comics, we know, has always been an analogy for the American Civil Rights Movement, and the characters of Magneto and Professor X was supposed to be inspired by MLK and Malcolm X. I mean, even Stan Lee himself said it, right? So it must be true. Except none of that is true. Not the whole thing, at least. And it's actually a huge misconception. It's also an example of Stan Lee taking credit for something he did not do. You know, for this next part, I'd just like to give a heads up. I am not American. As you can see, I have Southeast Asian lighting. So if I get anything wrong or inaccurate, or, you know, I might not fully understand the context and the true weight of some of these things, so please do correct me in the comment section, okay? So, anyways, first of all, there has always been this attempt by the American government and establishment to discredit, delegitimize, and to demonize the works and effort of Malcolm X, to portray him as this like violent and super radical individual, which is, you know, not even close to who he is, to a point where this has become sort of like the mainstream view of Malcolm X. Up until recent years, but this sentiment has changed, which is why if there are any stories from video games, movies, or comics that feature characters who are radical or even revolutionaries, this comparison always gets brought up. Hell, even I bought into it. Again, correct me if I'm wrong on this, but my guess it's because probably the way MLK was advocating his message was slightly more palatable for the whites in comparison to Malcolm X, who preached essentially the same thing as MLK, especially later on in his life, but in a more direct way, while also adding on to this idea that the establishment was oppressive not just to African Americans, but also everyone else who is not a part of the elite class. Truth is, while yes, Stan Lee did create the X-Men comics, the original run of the X-Men comics made by him did not have the same emphasis or depth on politics. It was meant to be just another group of heroes in Marvel's expanding roster. The political element of the X-Men would not be a thing until the series had a revamp in the 70s, made by Chris Claremont. The overall theme of the X-Men in this revamp was based on the struggles of different minorities. However, the characters of Professor X and Magneto was not based on either MLK or Malcolm X, but instead on two Israeli prime ministers, David Ben Gurion for Professor X and Menachem Begin for Magneto. The duality of these two characters was supposed to represent the two different sides of the Zionist ideology. On the one hand, we have David Ben Gurion, who was the first prime minister of Israel and represents a more moderate, or I guess left-leaning version of Zionism, looking up to figures like Lenin as inspiration, and also leading the centrist but on paper leftist faction of the Zionist labor movement. Ben Gurion instigated a policy of restraint, Havlaga, in which the Haganah and other Jewish militant groups did not retaliate for Arab attacks against Jewish civilians, concentrating only on self-defense. And his overall stance on the Palestinians and the rest of the Arab world was that of peaceful coexistence. But he did go back and forth between this view and the view that there could be no peace, much like Professor Xavier himself. See, most versions of Professor Xavier believed in peaceful coexistence with the humans, even as the humans continuously violate and brutalize the mutants. But of course, eventually he got radicalized by Magneto and his ex-girlfriend, I think, and then he became, this. So in the end, Xavier still views humanity, or humans, regular humans, as a threat to the existence of mutants. But sure, this theme of peaceful coexistence, it's quite universal, and in no way is a form of pro-Zionist propaganda on its own, which is why the character of Magneto is so important. See, the comparison with Malcolm X and Magneto never made sense. Ideologically, they share barely anything similar, but Magneto being inspired by Menachem Begin, again, I don't know which one is right, makes more sense and is more accurate to the character lore-wise. Considering in the comics, Magneto has always been framed as this sort of supremacist for mutant kind, and also tried to commit an act of genocide to regular humans. And actually, he did commit genocide in the Ultimate Comics, but you know, the original Ultimate Comics, but we don't talk about that one. Menachem Begin represents the far-right faction of the Zionist movement. He personally led Irgun, an extremist runaway of the already radical far-right militant group Haganah. Irgun as a group was described and identified as a terrorist organization by everyone. Even the Zionist movement itself identified Irgun as a terrorist organization. The group targeted the British in Palestine, with a notable attack being the King David hotel bombing. He was also very critical of the Zionist leadership at the time for being too friendly with the British. And here we can see that comparison with Magneto a little bit, where essentially Magneto kept calling Xavier a bitch and a sellout for constantly working with the humans. Irgun as a militant group itself is a bit strange. In the beginning, it was very anti-British colonial rule, even seeing itself having the same sort of struggle as the IRA in Ireland. But it itself is not really an anti-colonial movement, considering its most famous contribution was the Deir Yassin massacre. Later on, when Menachem became president of Israel, he had personally signed and authorized the Sabra and Shatila massacre. While Professor X was the story of a political figure believing in coexistence, the story of Magneto is not that of a disgruntled Holocaust survivor who is frustrated with the continued oppression of his group, but instead it's the story of a disgruntled Holocaust survivor who has no problem doing the same thing to people that does not belong in his group. See, Chris Claremont wanted to parallel Magneto to Menachem as someone who was originally this radical militant, evolving into someone who is worthy of a Nobel Peace Prize. Yes, Menachem Begin did win a Nobel Peace Prize for the Camp David Accords. Chris Claremont is a Zionist, a liberal Zionist, not that it matters to the Palestinians, who have been brutalized for decades, but you know, it shows up in his writings a lot for the X-Men, primarily with the storylines of the island of Genosha and Krakoa. Now, I'm not super up to date with the X-Men comics, and hell, my first introduction to Krakoa was from Marvel Rivals, so you know, I might be missing a lot of context here. I'ma keep it a buck. But the gist of it was, Genosha was supposed to be the safe haven for mutant kind, separate from the rest of humanity. Sound familiar? But this failed because, you know, the island was attacked by Sentinels. So then there was this other island called Krakoa, but the whole thing was, the common theme of these two storylines is that mutant kind needs to have their own safe haven. They need to have their own nation where they can be safe, where they can protect themselves. A safe place for mutants and only mutants. So while yes, the story of the X-Men is and can be interpreted as a story of the common struggle of oppressed minorities, it's important to understand that Chris Claremont was inspired by and had framed the story around Zionism. And this would also explain why non-mutant Marvel characters that pops up in these comics gets turned into the worst kind of bigot. Cause what the fuck you mean Captain America sounds like Nick Fuentes, bro? And that, in a way, is saying that Zionism is a good thing. It's just that there were a few bad actors like Menachem Begin. From this, it becomes clear that the story of the X-Men was not really about the civil rights movement, but rather the internal struggle of the Zionist movement and Israel. At the same time, it's trying to portray the Zionist movement in the same light as these other anti-colonial movements or even revolutionary movements, because it is framing Zionism as a movement of a group of oppressed people trying to retaliate or gain their liberation from an oppressor. Which is why any interpretation of media should require you to at least acknowledge the author's intent. You know, I see this many times both with people who don't have media literacy and people who claim they have media literacy. But in both cases, or both individuals, none of them bother to take the author's explicit intent and just infer the meaning of the series from within the media itself. Like bro, for some of them it's not even that hard. Like this specific example with the X-Men, it was on a Screen Rant article from like what, 6 years ago? Because here's the thing, right? If you did not take into account the explicit inspiration of these two characters, you would think that the story of the X-Men is about oppressed minorities. And while that is true, the framing here is important. The inspiration here is important because it changes the meaning and the context of everything. And I have said this before, media literacy is important for things like this, because without it, we get these huge misconceptions like with the X-Men, where it did not just delegitimizes the effort of Malcolm X, but also other oppressed minorities who had no other option but to act violently against their oppressors, much like what the Palestinians are going through right now. And in a way, the X-Men is basically an allegory for the IDF. Now, these are the only two examples that I could think about and I know of that have explicit Zionist and pro-Israel propaganda. But I'm pretty sure if you do enough digging, you can also find other piece of nerd media, so to speak, that contains explicit pro-Zionist, pro-Israel propaganda. Think about, Last of Us or anything Stephen King has touched. But to end it on a somewhat positive note, in the fan favorite IDW Transformers comics, the comics version of Megatron was this political activist and revolutionary back on Cybertron. Unfortunately, he eventually became power hungry and turned into a tyrant and started doing, normal Megatron things. But during the Decepticons' invasion of Earth, for whatever reason, he decided to go solo and went on to destroy Israel. Soloed Israel's military, destroyed their tanks, took it over for himself, and that's it really. Nothing happened after that. They didn't expand upon this idea. For some reason, he just went on a solo trip to Israel, destroyed their military, and then the comic continued as usual.
أنا دمي فلسطيني فلسطيني فلسطيني.